One of the things that Truman really focused on in his domestic policies was on the issue of civil rights. Civil rights had really come to the forefront during World War II. We had already mentioned in a previous podcast and video that World War II had promoted for the first time the idea of non-discrimination in hiring and promotion through the Fair Employment Practices Commission. We also discussed how African Americans frequently experienced discrimination on bases and in towns bases were located on during the war, so much so that Secretary of War Henry Stinson kept a safe in his file about racial disturbances in the military. And following the end of World War II, Congress decides not to make the Fair Employment Practices Commission permanent. So at the end of the war, the Fair Employment Practices Commission becomes dismantled. So at this point, states take up the slack, and 11 states, including New York, pass state level Fair Employment Practices Commission to continue mandating that you cannot discriminate in hiring and promotion on the basis of race, sex, religion, or any other category. With the end of World War II, we start to see a rise in states and cities also passing laws to try to minimize discrimination in things like housing, public accommodations, and education. In 1948, the Supreme Court case Shelley v. Kramer strikes down racially restrictive covenants, which means that you can no longer put in the deed of a property that it can only be occupied by white people. And we start to see a rise in voting registration and a decline of lynching. The rate of Black voter registration in the South increases by sevenfold during World War II, as many of these returning veterans declare that they are going to exercise their civil liberties and rights. Law enforcement begins to take lynching as a more serious crime and actually prosecute it, whereas before, vigilante mobs targeting African Americans for violence and killing them through extra judicial means had frequently just been overlooked by local law enforcement. Now it's starting to be taken seriously. So the states are largely taking the lead on these changes, but Truman gets a commission on civil rights formed, and he tasks them with filing a report on what the federal government can do to ensure access to civil liberties by everyone. And so in 1947, this Commission on Civil Rights issues a report called To Secure These Rights. And it suggested that the federal government should get actively involved to be able to combat racial discrimination, that leaving it to the states alone to pass non-discrimination laws was not enough, that it would result in very uneven application. And so it was the federal government's job to use the power of the government to help to ensure that minority groups were not discriminated against. So this played a role in Truman running for election in 1948. In 1948, Truman announced that for the first time in the history of the Democratic Party, there would be a civil rights platform. That part of his formal election platform would focus on what he and the party intended to do on civil rights. In this same year, 1948, Truman desegregates the military by executive order. So for the first time since the American Revolution, the armed forces will no longer be segregated by race. And as part of his civil rights platform, he asks for federal laws banning lynching and poll taxes, and for the Congress to consider other sorts of broad reforms targeting systemic racism. Now, Truman's embrace of a civil rights platform provoked a crisis within the Democratic Party. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party, led by folks like Hubert Humphrey, specifically pushed to add civil rights to the official platform of the party nationally. which led Southern Democrats who objected to the civil rights platform to walk out of the convention and to form a coalition with some Southern Republicans. So these Southern Democrats walk out of the Democratic National Convention and they form their own third party, the States' Rights Democratic Party. But nobody really calls them that. Everybody else calls them the Dixiecrats. Okay, so these Southern Democrats who objected to including a civil rights platform in the election of 1948. The Dixiecrats argued that they were the party that was supporting freedom, and that Truman's desire to use the federal government to enforce civil rights would, and I quote, convert America into a Hitler state, end quote. Okay, so that the federal government was imposing their will on states, particularly southern states, and infringing upon the rights and freedoms of states. The Dixiecrats chose as their presidential nominee Strom Thurmond, at the time the governor of South Carolina. After this, he will be a very long-serving member of the Senate. Strom Thurmond, as he was campaigning, claimed he was not a racist. He simply opposed excessive government. However, he also famously said during this campaign, and I quote, "All the laws of Washington and all the bayonets of the army cannot force the Negro into our homes, into our schools, our churches, and our places of recreation and amusement." Strom Thurmond will live to be about 101. He dies in 2003. And after his death, it's revealed that he actually had a secret love child with his family's black maid when he was a young man. And while he publicly espoused ideas that we would today be consider racist and opposed the expansion of civil rights throughout the South and opposed the end of segregation, he still continued to at least tacitly support his secret daughter throughout her life. Now, there was another challenge within the Democratic Party from the liberal wing of the Democratic Party who argued that Truman wasn't doing enough in terms of civil rights. So they launched their own party, the Progressive Party, and they nominate Henry Wallace as their candidate. The main difference between Wallace and Truman was on what to do over the Cold War. Wallace promoted an idea of international cooperation. So he said that we should not be antagonistic towards the Soviet Union. We should not be trying to see who can build up the most, nuclear arsenal the fastest, but instead we should work together as a broader coalition. So this now means that Truman has challengers from within his party, both in the form of the more conservative Democrats, the Dixiecrats, so Strom Thurmond, and the more liberal Democrats represented by the Progressive Party and Henry Wallace. Okay, so this means that the Republican candidate in this presidential race, Thomas Dewey, pretty much, in theory, should only have to keep his mouth shut and let the Democratic Party implode because their votes now are being split between three different candidates. So because of that, Dewey, throughout this campaign, was very reluctant to campaign excessively or to answer questions in any degree of specifics or detail, counting on the dysfunction of the Democrats to split the vote. So in the 1948 election, everyone was so confident that Dewey would win because of the division of the Democrats that the Chicago Daily Tribune printed out as their headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." And this was based on early projections that Dewey was able to win not only the popular vote, but also the Electoral College votes. However, something strange happens. Truman actually ended up winning, and not by a small margin either, but he ends up winning the Electoral College 303 to 189. So this is the story behind the iconic picture of Harry Truman holding up a newspaper declaring that he'd lost, because in this case, he had won, and the Chicago Daily Tribune just called the race the wrong way and too early. So this is a lesson to folks working in media and broadcasting, right? It ain't over till it's over, and make sure not to make definitive calls too early. So in this race, Dewey loses to Truman, but Wallace and Thurmond, as the Democratic alternates here, each received just over 1 million votes. So they don't have too bad of a showing. If you looked at the Electoral College map, Thurmond actually does manage to pull votes in Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and because Tennessee was doing proportional voting in the Electoral College still at this time, he actually snagged 1 vote there too. Okay. Now, the Democratic Party will not again permanently split at this time. They will actually recover from this election, and they'll run as unified Democrats for the next several election cycles. But this breakup over civil rights, this breakup over how far the party wanted to support the idea of the federal government taking a more active role in telling states that they could not discriminate. This is eventually going to drive a wedge, a permanent wedge, into the Democratic Party that we're really going to see Richard Nixon start to exploit when he campaigns ultimately successfully for president in 1968. Although, as we'll talk about in a future class, that's not the first time he tries to run for president. Now, the impact of Truman's civil rights platform is something that we really can't emphasize enough, because Truman, in adopting this, is not necessarily only doing this from the goodness of his heart. Truman is also doing this because of the Cold War, right? This was a common critique by the Soviet Union that the United States did not give civil liberties and equal rights to all of its people. So this was Truman also trying to shore up what was a weak spot for the United States that was commonly picked on by the Soviets in propaganda. While this embrace of the civil rights platform does create a split in the Democratic Party, there will be this emphasis on unity and particularly conformity over dissent. And this is going to be a common theme throughout the rest of the Cold War, this emphasis on people towing the party line, on not wanting to rock the boat or speak out of turn, lest they also be considered suspect. And particularly at this point in time, the worst thing that someone could accuse you of was of being a communist. More on that point next time. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Esmacher.